All right, so we're going to shift topics a little bit now in the biology lecture. If you kind of think about it, there's a few big mysteries regarding life on Earth. One of them is, how do we have the vast amount of diversity of species, of life forms that we do have on our planet? And that question can be answered pretty well by the processes of speciation and evolution by natural selection and other evolutionary processes. But there's another big mystery, and that is how life originally got started on Earth. This is much more difficult to answer, for one thing, because by all the evidence that we have, this event, this origin of life, happened a really, really long time ago. And for good reason, because we're dealing with just very simple molecules. This wouldn't be something necessarily that would show up at all in the fossil record. So we're going to look at this mystery and kind of what we know so far about how life began on Earth. So for the news for today's lecture, I'm going to describe a little bit later in the lecture this classic experiment maybe you've heard of called the Urey-Miller experiment, where they basically tried to replicate the conditions of early Earth and showing, can you get complex organic molecules? So in this new version of the experiment, they did this again. So they made a new set of experiments, this time using only two naturally occurring precursor molecules. So starting with hydrogen cyanide and water, which are both naturally occurring on Earth, not requiring living organisms in order to exist. So just based on these two precursors, the scientists were able to create an amino acid as well as precursors to RNA. So this is another good indication that, yes, given the right conditions, even starting with very simple molecules, you could get more complex molecules that are typical for living things. So in this lecture, which is kind of a shorter lecture, we're going to ask the question, what is life? And then we're going to talk about different definitions of life, and then how life got started. And at this point, I can't tell you conclusively, okay, this is how life began, but I'm going to share with you some of the popular hypotheses that do have some scientific evidence backing them. And there's the textbook chapter that talks about life generally. All right, so let's think about life. So what characteristics does life have? Like if you're looking around the world, if you're thinking about our planet, and you think about things that we consider to be alive, like plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, viruses you may or may not include in this right now. Think about things that are alive, and then think about things that we don't usually think of as alive, and then try and imagine in your head, what's the big difference here? Like, what would separate out life from non-life? What's the most important characteristics? How could you say that, a plant is alive, but a rock or the sun is not alive? What allows us to separate those two sets of objects? So just think about this a little bit on your own. Here are some popular elements in a definition of life. So if you look at textbooks, you'll commonly find some of these as, characteristics of life. So one of them is being made up of cells, at least one cell. And if this was part of your definition of life, being made up of cells, then you would necessarily exclude viruses, because viruses are not made of cells. And I'm not sure if there's a good explanation as to why being made of cells is required for life, but that shows up commonly in definitions. Metabolizes, so a life form is something that changes energy from one form to another. So we all have processes of, taking in some type of food and using the energy in that food, whatever it is, to change things in our own body, to build molecules. So we have some type of metabolism. We regulate our internal conditions, which is called homeostasis. So in the case of a human, we maintain our temperature, we maintain our blood pressure, we maintain a whole lot of different aspects of ourselves. Living things grow and reproduce, that's commonly included as a definition as well. And they have some type of a genetic system, which for cellular life would be based on DNA. And that they evolve. So there's some process here by which a living species, a population, will change through time by evolutionary processes, which would also build on the fact that it has a genetic system. So these are all traits that are often included in definitions of life. You know, I'm not saying necessarily that all of these are necessary, just that you know, you can kind of think of, you know, which of these parts of the definition is important, which ones do you think really vitally corresponds to living things. So your textbook, if you look at when it talks about living things and it discusses viruses, it doesn't consider viruses to be alive. It calls them biological entities, and biological means living, so you're basically calling them living entities without saying that they're alive, which to me doesn't make a lot of sense. But if viruses are not considered alive, what exactly are they? And if you found life on another planet, like let's say you were exploring maybe Mars, possibly under the surface of the planet of Mars, there's liquid water under the surface, there could be life there. Do you think if you found life on another planet that had originated separately from life on Earth, do you really think it necessarily would be made up of cells? You know, have a double phospholipid layer covering their internal parts of their you know genetic material and so on. Does it have to be made of phospholipids? You know, does it have to be a cell? You know, a virus also has a protein capsule surrounding itself. So is having a phospholipid-based cell membrane necessary? Would it necessarily have DNA if you found life on another planet that originated separately from us? Is that the only way you could have a genetic molecule that would allow for evolution? So the sun metabolizes, it changes energy from one form to another. It's a nuclear reactor. A thermostat in your house maintains homeostasis. A raindrop grows, crystals grow. Are these alive? So what is unique about life? What is the characteristic of a life that really tells you this is something different? This is something unique? Because I would argue if you find other parts of our universe that have metabolism, that have homeostasis, that grow and reproduce, then those attributes are not unique to life. So what is unique about life? I would argue that the unique quality of life is that it evolves. So my own definition of life, and as you'll find out that, you know, different scientists, different researchers tend to have their own definition. So under my definition, anything that evolves would be alive, because the unique trait of life is that it evolves. That's the one thing that living things do that non-living things do not do. They evolve. And evolution is complicated because it requires a process of self-replication. So this organism has to be capable of reproducing, but there has to be some possibility of error. There has to be a possibility of mutation. If you have some mutations combined with reproduction, then that could allow you to generate diversity within that life form. And with the diversity, you can have the process of, you know, evolution by natural selection occurring. So under my definition, viruses would be classified as alive because they evolve. They're not made of cells. They don't metabolize by themselves. They require a host to reproduce, but they do evolve. They evolve through time, and so I would classify them as alive. So scientists do disagree about what exactly life is, how exactly you can separate life from non-life. And there's also a disagreement about how life came to exist. And this is healthy. Science progresses through sometimes fierce disagreement and debate about issues. And it's also that, you know, we just don't have super great information about, the status of living organisms going back, billions of years. Like the fossil record that far back is pretty scarce, and we just don't know exactly which of these hypotheses is the most accurate one. But let's take a look at the most popular hypotheses scientists have come up with about how life originated. So although there are different hypotheses, scientists from these different camps would all agree about certain facts regarding Earth and Earth's history. So for all of these hypotheses, they would tend to agree that the Earth formed approximately 4.6 billion years ago from the accumulation of space dust and rocks. So gravity caused all of these little tiny space dust pieces and rocks to accumulate into a ball eventually that we would call planet Earth. And here's a little video showing you these processes when Earth formed.
Vast spirals of dust began to form. And at the center of one of these, a rocky planet called Earth started to take shape. Built of stardust and assembled by gravity. Fast forward 100 million years, and it had grown into a giant ball, sweeping up billions of tons of celestial debris. This is where the Earth came from, and therefore how you and I began. But our planet would have remained a large, sterile ball of rock and metals and minerals forever, were it not for one more event, one more expression of the forces of nature. 93 million miles away, at the heart of the giant nebula, the pressure and temperature of a ball of hydrogen gas had become so great that the atoms were beginning to fuse. A new star, our sun, was coming to life.
Okay, so we had the Earth forming very long time ago, and when this new planet first formed, it didn't have much of an atmosphere, and the outer surface would have been covered with hot, molten rock. It's predicted that the surface temperature at that point was about 1800 degrees Celsius, which would be extremely hot. So, but also, this is kind of a new area of our science. We've recently discovered that our planet from the beginning was covered with water. In the past, scientists used to think that water arrived later, but there's recently been evidence that has suggested that water's been there pretty much from the beginning. Although, this early Earth being so hot would probably not have been conducive to life at that point. But after a few 100 million years, over time, the Earth started to settle down and cool. But this is only the surface. The Earth's core has continued to remain very hot, about 6,000 degrees Celsius for billions of years. So part of what happened is that the very hot, highly energetic radioactive materials, radioactive elements, settled down towards the Earth's core, and then the lighter elements, which tended to not be as hot or as radioactive, they would rise up to the outer surface. And there's a few reasons why the Earth's core has continued to be hot. Part of it is radioactive decay. Part of it is just the initial heat from the Earth's formation. But as you can see, as you go down, as you dig down into the Earth, the temperature steadily rises until you get to the inner core at about 6,000 degrees Celsius. So something else that's common about all of these hypotheses is that the first organisms you would have started off with were not cellular. They were some type of self-replicating organic molecule, like a piece of protein or DNA or RNA. And sometime later, this early life would have evolved a membrane, an outer covering. And the purpose of this membrane kind of on a basic level, is to protect the genetic code, the DNA, from the external environment. It's to act as a barrier so you can protect that DNA from damage that it would receive from interacting with foreign chemicals. So the first life forms would have just been a self-replicating piece of some molecule, and then later on you would have had the evolution of a cell membrane. So this is one of the popular hypotheses, and one of the first hypotheses that was put forward, called the primordial soup hypothesis. So in this story of life's origins, the early Earth had very low oxygen levels, and we pretty much know that that's true. So there was very little oxygen in early Earth, and that's important because oxygen tends to break down complex molecules. So you had these shallow pools, and you had lightning and solar energy. They stimulated reactions of molecules of naturally occurring chemicals like ammonia, methane, and hydrogen. And all of these different reactions would create kind of simple organic molecules, like molecules you would find now in living things, like amino acids or the building blocks of DNA would have been formed from these reactions. And a famous series of experiments, the Muller-Urey experiments, scientists recreated these conditions. They used electricity to simulate lightning, and they ended up producing, from non-living chemical components, they created amino acids and other organic compounds. So they showed that it's possible for you to create more complex molecules just by adding a little bit of external energy, in this case by electricity, lightning. So the second hypothesis we're going to look at is called the deep sea vent hypothesis. So under this hypothesis, life didn't get started kind of on the surface of the water in these shallow pools. It got started at the bottom of the ocean, at deep sea volcanic vents. So as you remember, I think I talked about these volcanic vents previously. There are these vents at the bottom of the ocean that spew out volcanic material, really hot sulfur and other chemicals. And there's quite a lot of life that lives down there associated with these volcanic vents, including lithotrophic bacteria. So the reaction of these volcanic minerals with water produce a lot of energy, and this energy could have been used to build complex organic molecules. And just to bring in a little bit of chemistry, chemical reactions here that release energy are referred to as exothermic. Okay? And chemical reactions which absorb energy are called endothermic. So in this example here, those reactions of volcanic minerals with water would be exothermic because they release energy, and the reactions that build complex organic molecules would be endothermic. So they're using the energy from these volcanic mineral reactions in order to build complex life molecules. So another hypothesis claims that the first life forms were actually not that much like us. They weren't made of proteins or DNA or RNA, but the first life forms were crystals. So crystals are molecules or atoms that are arranged in very specific patterns. And crystals can grow. They replicate this pattern, including replicating any imperfections that exist in the pattern. And that's kind of like life, that you have replication with, the possibility of replicating errors. So this hypothesis is called the clay hypothesis. And under this hypothesis, you first would have kind of like crystalline life, so crystals replicating themselves, and then eventually the crystals would be kind of attached to, associated with typical organic molecules like DNA or RNA, and then eventually life would transition from crystalline replication to replication of these organic molecules. But if you look at the growth of crystals, it does look a little bit like the growth of some living organism. So let's take a look at some crystal videos. Here are some crystals growing under a microscope. So I think if I showed you that video and you hadn't seen crystals before, you didn't know what they were, someone could think, oh, that kind of looks like the growth of a slime mold or a bacteria. You know, it's something kind of replicating itself. Here's time-lapse photography of crystalline growth. So as we look through these hypotheses, one of the features that we see that differentiates the hypotheses is that their initial point, their initial position where life evolved is different in the hypotheses. So under this hypothesis, life originally got started inside of solid ice. And part of the evidence that supports this hypothesis is the fact that we know that some bacteria can survive inside of ice. Because of impurities inside of the ice, there are these little thin liquid veins inside of ice. And right now, there's living bacteria that survive inside of those veins. And some scientists believe that those little liquid veins would be the best origin point for life. And part of the reason for this is that ice can protect organic molecules from harmful UV radiation. So UV radiation, not all of it could pass through the ice. So it would give these original replicating molecules protection so that they could replicate themselves without being degraded by UV radiation. And it also tends to concentrate chemicals in solution. So because these veins are very small in volume, any chemicals that exist inside of there would be at a high concentration. And scientists have done experiments to show that if you put cyanide inside of these ice veins along with other small chemicals that are all naturally occurring on planet Earth, they've been able to create adenine, a nitrogenous base, and one of the building blocks for nucleic acids. So some scientists believe that life didn't begin on Earth's surface at all, but it started miles below the surface of the Earth, and this is called the deep hot biosphere hypothesis. So under this hypothesis, life got started deep underground, and part of the evidence for this is that when people have sampled underground, they found quite a bit of life there. There's lithotrophic bacteria as well as roundworms that will eat this bacteria. We've been able to find them miles under the surface of the Earth, and some scientists believe that this might just be the tip of the iceberg, that there could be much more life under the surface of the Earth than there is on the surface of the Earth. And so under this hypothesis, these first life forms weren't getting energy from the sun, they were getting energy from deep inside of the Earth. So the Earth itself creates energy, which is what these lithotrophic bacteria live off of. So maybe the first life forms were kind of like these bacteria, and then eventually they kind of spilled over onto the Earth's surface. Okay. Another hypothesis that has a lot of evidence suggesting it is called the alien origins hypothesis. And so alongside this hypothesis, there's another related hypothesis called panspermia. And this is just the hypothesis that life can travel through space. So life has moved from one planet to another. So some scientists believe that life on Earth didn't originate on Earth. It originated somewhere else in the universe, like, for example, Mars. And based on, the geology and studying of Mars and Mars history, scientists have identified that up until about 3.5 billion years ago, Mars would have been quite hospitable. It would have had liquid oceans covering its surface. It would have had a nice protective atmosphere. So it's quite possible that there would have been life on Mars at that point in time, which would have overlapped with the time when we had life on Earth. So if a little chunk of Mars ended up traveling to Earth and spreading life there, we could have all be descendants of those original Martian life forms. And there's other parts of our solar system as well that quite possibly have life. So for example, Europa, the moon of Jupiter, has oceans underneath the surface that could support life. And more evidence supporting this hypothesis is the fact that Bacterial spores are very hardy, so they can survive inside of ice, also can survive really high temperatures and pressures associated with atmospheric entry. In fact, here's some bacteria that survived in space for 2 years, in a dormant stage. And when you sample meteors, comets, and space dust, they contain naturally occurring components of RNA and DNA, as well as amino acids. So we find, evidence of simple organic molecules in these space materials. And they probably just formed in outer space due to solar radiation. So it's also possible that life could have formed, just in outer space due to the energy from the sun. So those are the major hypotheses scientists have put forward for the origin of life on Earth. And at this point, we don't really know which one is the most likely one. More evidence will come in, people will do more experiments, and possibly in the future, we'll eventually get to the point where we'll say, this is the most likely hypothesis. But at this point, we're not there. But for all of these different hypotheses, scientists in general would agree that life got started as some sort of self-replicating organic molecule. So an organic molecule is a carbon-rich molecule that makes up the body of living things. And all life on Earth, if you look at bacteria, even viruses, eukaryotic life, we're all made up of the same stuff, like nucleic acids, proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. So as different as our bodies look, we're all made up of these same kind of classes of organic molecules. But there is some disagreement about which of these organic molecules the first replicator was. One of the earliest ideas was that the first replicating molecule was likely a piece of RNA, and that's partially because RNA can function as a catalyst. So an RNA molecule can be used to speed up the rate of a reaction. And hypothetically, RNA could be used to catalyze its own replication. So if you had RNA, it could enable itself to replicate more pieces of RNA, and that makes it a popular candidate as that initial organic molecule. The hypothesis that the first molecule was RNA is called RNA world. But other scientists have proposed different ideas, that the first organic molecule was a fat, which is called lipid world, or even a small protein, which is called peptide world. So there's still some disagreement here about, what was the initial organic molecule that eventually would have given rise to other types of organic molecules. All right, so that finishes this kind of brief lecture on the origin of life. So I'm going to post this as an online assignment, but I want you to think about life and the origin of life. So the first question here, which definition of life do you think is the most useful? You could come up with your own, but basically here you're coming up with, how would you separate life from non-life? So what is the important characteristics that you would say, have to be associated with life? And then for question 2, based on whatever definition you came up with for question 1, would you classify fire as being alive? Would viruses be alive? Would a language be alive? If you think about fire, fire grows, it can reproduce. You can have one fire that becomes 2 fires. It metabolizes, it changes energy from one form to another. Would viruses be alive? They are not made of cells, they don't metabolize, but they do have a genetic system and they do replicate and evolve. Is a language alive? So languages are ideas, but through time, they do evolve in a sense. You have, a language changing as time goes on, and languages replicate into different bodies. So if you teach someone a language, if a baby learns a language, that language is replicating into the mind of this other individual. So kind of think about whether you would consider these different objects to be alive. And number 3, out of the hypotheses that I talked to you about, which one do you think is the most likely and why? Do any of these hypotheses seem to make more sense to you? So this will be your online assignment, which I'll put online very soon.